other insects in Lepidoptera order that produce and store honey. The first one, of course, we all know this is the Apis mellifera, the Western honeybee, it's the most common one that we see out here. And the article produced this as like a baseline compared to other ones. So the first one is the stinging bee. So this is a group of about 500 species. They're pretty good honey producers and pollinators. They're mostly found in tropical and subtropical regions of Australia, Africa, Southeast Asia, and Americas. So the honey tastes different. Oh, that's what they state in the article. That tastes different, has different consistency, has more watery texture. It's less viscous, and the taste they claim it to be tangy, but not as sweet as the Western honeybee honey. The honey is not really as popular as the regular honey because I guess they produce less compared to the Western honeybees.
There's some space. Yeah.
And they state that to harvest the honey is actually more complicated than the regular honeybees. So they briefly explain bumblebees and wasps. But for bumblebees, they produce honey, but it's very little. And what they produce is mainly utilized to feed the queen. And the wasps, there's different, there's certain species of big wasps that produce honey. But the most common one, the one that they're familiar with, is the Mexican honey wasp. And according to the article, some cultures in Mexico actually consider it a delicacy. And this one's the one that stood out the most to me, the honey pot ants. So basically, the way they store the honey or nectar is by absorbing it, and their abdomens increase in size many times bigger than they actually are. And they hold it in there and they use it to feed the queen. They use it for winter to feed on it. But some people actually harvest it, mainly indigenous communities in arid regions. But they don't only just collect nectar from the flowers, they also collect sap leaks from plant stems and honeydew that's produced from aphids and scale insects. Just really short, that's the last slide, but also I didn't include in the PowerPoint. In some places, I forgot where, but they actually, the honeydew from the insects, the stuff you see on the sidewalk, the black stuff, and the stuff on the plants, they actually harvest that and actually consume it. It's a delicacy, and I think it's Germany or something like that. The German black forest honey. I think it's pretty famous over there. But I never heard of it over here. I didn't even know this was a thing, honey pot ants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is. Yeah, I've heard about these guys. It's just a really sort of extreme case of caste differentiation. Yeah, once these guys are full, basically their whole life is just hanging from the ceiling of the nest and storing honeydew for everybody else to eat. It's pretty cool. All right. Well, hey, thank you for bringing it in. Much appreciated, Eric. I guess on another note, these Melapanini bees, these were the bees. Sometimes you'll hear reports of, so when the Europeans came to when the Europeans came to North America, they brought along Western honeybees, and there's all these stories about Native Americans referring to honeybees as being like the white man's fly and all this business like that. But there was some level of beekeeping in South America, but it was because they were keeping these Melapanini bees. And if you go down to South America, there are, still some cultures that are keeping these bees and cultivating the honey, but they are largely being displaced by the Africanized honeybees because they are just so effective at utilizing pollen resources that they can sort of force these bees out of certain areas or just so thoroughly outcompete them for available nectar resources.
Is this a bee that also is used to pollinate the vanilla flower? Is it this same?
Oh, I don't know. Possibly. I haven't heard of that. Does the vanilla flower have like a very specific bee?
Yeah, it's small enough to be able to fit into the area where it's supposed to be pollinated.
Interesting. Can look into that. I'm curious. Okay, so I reposted Lecture 5 to include stuff past the honeybee's head, so you might want to re-download that. Excuse me. So just a few announcements before we go. A slight change of schedule. Billy Sink, who I originally had at the end of the semester, he's with a program called Project 8%, which basically does honeybee habitat restoration. They supply seeds to growers so that if you're, say, like planting a new almond orchard, they'll give you wildflower seeds to plant in between the rows and things like that to provide a pollination habitat for the first couple of years. But he's going to come in and talk to us, and he wants to come in on the 19th. The 19th was originally when we were supposed to have our first exam. So we're not going to have the exam at that time, obviously. I pushed it back one day, so now it'll be Thursday the 21st. So that's sort of the first big schedule change. Beyond that, Ranveer was supposed to present on the 21st, so I'm moving him all the way back to April 23rd. So, and then Mateo already actually bumped into you, but as a reminder, you're on April 25th. Beyond that, a reminder that the Beekeeper Symposium is coming up on the 23rd, which is 3 weekends from now, so 3 Saturdays off. Just as a reminder, basically it's a whole bunch of beekeepers are getting together at the Degant headquarters here in town, which is down at like Winery and Ashland area. Basically, if you go, there's a $20 student ticket. So you're getting the member rate if you wish to attend. And if you attend, it includes, I believe it's a tri-tip lunch. But either way, they've got some really good speakers. They've got some professional beekeepers, Rich Brown, David Winter, Dr. Alina Nino, Dr. Gordon Wardell, I believe, are beekeeper extension specialists from the state. So they'll be coming in and talking about some of their work. It looks like it's going to be interesting. I'm going to go. The only trick is I need to know by this Friday if you're planning on going, because that's when the deadline for early tickets ends, and you won't be able to get the $20 deal. So if you want to go, just email me that you want to, and I will request the tickets. You can purchase the tickets online from cvbeekeepers.info, but it's through an online carrier, so they're going to charge you like an extra $250 convenience fee. But if I just contact them and tell them to hold the tickets, then it'll just be the flat 20. So again, if you're interested, just let me know.
What if we buy the tickets after this Friday?
After this Friday, then it'll go up to the higher rate. I don't know if they'll still give you $10 off. Maybe it'll just go up to $30. So yeah, I think you'll just get the CVEA member rate for the late fee. Mostly, they want an idea of how many people are coming so they know how much food to order, how much space they need to clear out, all of that. So they just want that ahead of time. All right, so last time we talked about the eyes for quite a while, just mostly because I think the eyes are really interesting and how bees see the world is really interesting. But there's a lot more to the bee. Again, we're focusing on things that have been modified in bees compared to other insects. So as far as the antennae are concerned, they're pretty typical of other insects. They have about 12 segments, but they are a little unique in that they have sort of that classic Hymenopteran geniculate shape, right, where the antenna elbow. They've got an elongate scape. Remember, the scape is the segment that attaches to the head itself, and then it elbows at the pedicle, and then they've got, about 10 or 11 flagellomeres out towards the end, creating that nice elbow shape. And just as a reminder, the antennae are the primary way that the insects sort of sense the world other than sight. It has their smell, their taste, but in honeybees it also has a variety of other things you can detect. Honeybees are kind of famous for being able to detect wind speed. They can detect relative humidity in the air. They use that to regulate. They use that to regulate their humidity within their hives. And bees actually, with their antennae, can even sense gravity. And that's one way that they can orient themselves within the hive. If you remember all the way back to entomology, one thing that bees also have that is different is they have specialized chewing, lapping mouthparts, which we don't really find in any other group of insects anywhere. This is specific to bees, and pretty specific to honeybees, actually, where what they have is a set of chewing components, the labrum and the mandibles. So the labrum is pretty much unmodified. You just have that front lip that's designed for holding food or wax inside the mouth. And then you have a pair of mandibles off to the side that are there for chewing. Now, within the bees, the mandibles are largely there for manipulating wax. Certainly there's a little bit of chewing motion that's going to go on when you're consuming bee bread or consuming pollen for energy. But for the most part, what these bees are doing is they're picking up wax, they're manipulating it, they're shaving it, using it to form the hive. So that's the big reason they have these. And what we find is that, in worker bees, they've got these spoon-shaped mandibles that have extremely sharp edges, but they don't have very much muscle, so it's not like they can really bite you very hard. So it's not a protective thing. It's more like having sort of a lathe or a chisel on your head. It's used for shaving off the wax in thin layers in order to get it to the right thickness. And then once we get past the labrum and the mandibles, the maxilla and the labium have been modified into the lapping features, where basically they've been elongated and turned into tubes, which can be folded together to create a long proboscis, which is used for sucking the nectar out of flowers. Yeah. So basically, it's just a long sucking tube. It has sort of an inner chamber and an outer chamber, and at the end, it's got this spoon-like structure. It's used for sort of scooping nectar out. And then, whenever you look at a bee's tongue, sometimes you'll notice it's got these two wings hanging off the side. Those are the palpi from the labia. So this guy and this guy, they just kind of hang off the side. But that's largely sensory, covered in hairs for smelling the nectar, smelling the flowers, sort of identifying food sources with the tongue. There we go. And then to wrap up the head is also the spot where there's a lot of important glands that are essential to functioning as a beehive. For the most part, what we find is that these glands tend to attach to the mouthparts, and then they are there to secrete substances onto those mouthparts, and those substances will have some sort of impact on the outside world. Perhaps the most notable of these is the mandibular gland, which on this figure is MDGLD, this guy right here. So the mandibular gland is kind of this little sac right here, right above the mandibles. So in the queen, the mandibular gland is essential for secreting the queen mandibular pheromone. And this is the pheromone that the queen uses to really lock down behavior in the hive. This is how she basically tells the workers, I'm the queen, I'm in charge, you're doing what I say. So it controls swarming behavior, it controls when mating occurs, it is the chemical that inhibits ovary development in the workers, and that's why when the queens get old, oftentimes workers will start producing eggs and start laying eggs, and that's a sign that you need to replace your queen, and that's because she stopped producing mandibular gland. Mandibular queen pheromone in high enough portions. The other important gland, and this one's much more important from a worker perspective, is this hypopharyngeal gland. Whoa, I'm on the tick marker. Hypopharyngeal gland, HFGLD on the figure. So right above the mandibular gland, right at the front of the head. This guy produces royal jelly, which, as we mentioned last time, is what's fed to the baby bees when they're first born. So a really important gland in the workers. And then we have a pair of labial glands, the head labial glands and the thoracic labial glands. And these are pretty typical insect salivary glands. So basically, they produce things like digestive enzymes, so that when the bees are eating, they sort of pre-digest the food before it goes into their gullet. They also produce some of the enzymes that are important for ripening nectar into honey. But those are split between the thorax and the head. But the main point being that they're mostly just regular old-fashioned digestive glands. So they're important, but they're not particularly unique amongst insects. All right. So let's talk about the femur, the bee thorax really quickly. So going back to entomology again, the thorax, right, in insects is the locomotion center. It's where they have their legs, it's where they have their wings, it's how they move around in the world. Now, bee wings, does anyone remember the modification that Hymenoptera have to their wings? They take the two sets of wings and they hook them together, right? They have those little hooks called the hamuli. That's all I'm going to say about that. They have hamuli. But the legs are actually pretty distinctly modified and are interesting to look at because the legs are the primary way that bees carry and collect pollen. So they have a fair number of modifications to those to make them better at carrying pollen. But just to get into this, a reminder that insect legs have 5 segments, moving at those that are the most basal, being closest to the body, to those that are most distal. We have the coxa, the trochanter, the femur, the tibia, and the tarsi. The tarsi are composed of individual small segments called the tarsus, and then at the tip we usually have tarsal claws and an aerolium. And then oftentimes on the tibia we have a pair of what are called spines or spurs down near the base that are used for any number of functions on insects. Bees use those to quite a number of uses. Just a reminder of those, we're going to be talking about the tibia and the tarsi a lot when we talk about bees, so the last 2 segments. So if we look at a bee leg, an important feature to recognize is something called the basitarsus. Basically what this is it's the very first segment of the bee's tarsi. Bees have 5 tarsal segments. The very first one, the one that's closest to the tibia, is enlarged and is incredibly hairy. We call that the basitarsus. Generally, the hairs are all concentrated along the outside edge, which some people will call the pollen comb. This is used for raking pollen out of the hair on the body and collecting it all in one place. Yeah, and then they also will use that pollen comb to pass pollen between the legs. So they'll collect pollen on, they'll use their forelegs to, rake pollen off of their head, and they'll pass that pollen to their midleg. The midleg will rake it off the front leg. Midleg will then rake it off onto the hind leg, where it's collected into those little pollen packs that you see bees carrying. Once you're past the basitarsus, you have 4, pretty typical tarsal segments after that, just like a regular foot, used for grabbing onto things. At the very end, you'll have 2 claws. Again, pretty typical. And then right past that, you'll have the aerolium, which, if you remember, is just a soft pad that insects have on the tip of their foot. That oftentimes gives them some grip so they can grab onto things. And in the bees, they actually have a gland in their aerolium that secretes pheromones. And they use that to mark things that other bees should be interested in, like food sources or water. Yeah. And in general, what we find is that all legs are extremely hairy and are built for collecting pollen. So as far as the forelegs are concerned, the forelegs are used by the bee primarily to clean themselves. So they use it to clean their heads, to clean their antennae, and basically to get any pollen that is collected on the front of their body. And as you've probably seen, bees oftentimes sort of dive headfirst into flowers, and so it's not unusual for them to collect a lot of pollen on the front of their bodies. One thing that I found that I didn't know about before I wrote this was that on their forelegs they have a special feature called an antenna cleaner, right here, where basically part of the tarsus and in some cases parts of the tibia are hollowed out into a little semicircle that the antenna can fit in. And then the tibial spine is modified into this elongate structure called a velum. Basically, the bee can sort of just slip its antenna up inside of there, and when it flexes its legs shut, it'll pinch the antenna. It can just sort of pull the antenna through and get all the pollen off into a little bundle on the outside of the leg. So we can see this. This bee is going to clean its antenna. I'll play this a few times. You see it? Right? So you can actually see right here, see this little gap? You can see that little light-colored spot. That's the antenna cleaner right there in the joint between the tibia and the tarsus. So let's watch that again. It's pretty cute. And one more time. There we go. It is a regular discussion amongst entomology students, or entomology graduate students at least, that if you could have a giant insect, which one would you take? Honeybees are usually up there. Some people want bumblebees, jumping spiders, but I'm generally not a fan of anything that could eat me, so not going for that. I'm sorry, we had a question.
Is it just honeybees then that have that special modification?
You know, I just heard about it here with the honeybees. So it's possible that other insects have it, but I haven't heard of it until I read about honeybees. So I'm guessing it's not many of them. But I mean, lots of insects are very interested in cleaning their faces. Something to keep in mind with honeybees is, if you remember, going back, one of the key characteristics of bees is that they have hairy eyeballs. And so, you know, bees have generally forelegs that are modified for a lot more cleaning than other insects have because they just get dust and pollen all over everything, even their eyes. The midlegs. Midlegs, again, are used for passing pollen from the forelegs back to the hind legs. The midlegs also can be reached up over the backs and comb the sides of the thorax and the body. But the one really unique feature is the midlegs, and I couldn't find a nice picture of this. But the midlegs, the spur, is a little extra large and extra strong, and it's used for skewering the wax scales that accumulate on the abdomen. So they'll reach back and they'll sort of take the spine and push it down on the wax scales and pull it out so that they can chew on it and manipulate it into comb structure. But as you can see, again, they've got this large tarsus with an extra thick layer of hairs along the edge. And then finally, the most modified of the legs is the hind leg. And that's because the hind legs are modified for carrying pollen bundles. You've probably all seen the honeybees flying around with the big packet of pollen on their legs, right? Those are on the hind legs, up on the tibia. Specifically, what they have is a polished, hairless cavity on the outside of the tibia that is called the corbicula, or the pollen basket. Either of those terms is perfectly acceptable. And generally what that is just an area that is reasonably hairless. It's surrounded by a whole lot of very long hairs. And this is just the area where when pollen gets picked, it gets sort of mashed up onto that, and it will slowly just accumulate. It doesn't show up very well in this picture, but oftentimes there's sort of a single long hair going right down through the middle of that, and the pollen is sort of packed up against that single hair, almost like skewering something for a shish kebab. Yeah. Yeah, and functionally this is just, where they carry these temporarily when they're going back and forth from the flowers to the hive. Beyond that, they have another important structure right below that corbicula, which is called the pollen press. And functionally, it's exactly what it sounds like. When the bees are collecting all this pollen on their body, the pollen is sort of loose, it's dusty. They need to find some way to compact it so that they can carry a lot of pollen and not lose it at regular intervals. So typically what a bee will do is when they're collecting pollen off their body, they will lick their forelegs with their tongue, and they'll secrete a little bit of saliva and enzymes. The pollen will get pulled into that saliva and become sort of a bit more like sort of like a paste. And then when they pass that paste all the way back, it will eventually be collected in this row of hairs at the base of the tibia, which is called the pollen rake. The pollen rake holds the hairs in place, and then the bee will flex its legs. It'll smash the basitarsus and the tibia up against each other, and this flattened area on the top of the basitarsus, you can see it right here, will mash up against that rake and push everything super flat. That's the auricle, and basically that'll create a little pollen patty. One of the legs will then sort of scoop that patty up and push it up onto the corbicula, or the pollen basket, and store it there. Right, so basically, forelegs collect pollen from the head, midlegs from the body, hind legs from the abdomen. They all pass it back. They put it into the auricle, the flattened area on the basitarsus. They put it on the pollen rake. Put it on the pollen rake. They flex that pollen rake so it gets smashed up against the auricle, create a little pollen patty that gets put up onto the corbicula. So yeah, basic outline there.
That pollen patty, what they call it, bee bread or no?
The final product where they have them all pushed together is, the bee bread. I've got a little video where you can see some of this biz happening. So here you can see a really nice bee bread being held on the hind leg. So this would be the femur, here's the tibia, and you can see they've basically filled up the whole leg with it. And what this bee is basically going to do is to groom itself. And what I would say is keep an eye on the legs. You're going to see that the forelegs will reach back and tap the midlegs, which is exchanging pollen, and then the midlegs will go and they'll actually scrape themselves clean on the pollen rake. Unfortunately, the pollen rake is hidden behind this ball, but you can see the legs sort of flexing and doing that little pollen press move. Let's see. Let's set this on. Oh, we're already at the... we gotta get that high quality going. I'm not watching low quality bees. All right, so here's, see the bees licking the forelegs, getting some saliva on those combs, and there they were passing it off. Oh my gosh, shaky. So there, you see the transfer on the legs on the other side. And then the bee doing that little step is the process of squashing with the pollen press. Yeah, you're right. There's a fair chunk right there. Now she's shuffling off. She's got all her pollen. It's a good question. I don't know how much a bee bread usually weighs. I would imagine they're
pretty heavy because I see them actually struggle sometimes.
Uh-huh.
They're trying to fly up.
Yeah, I I think you're right. That it has enough weight. You would think the bees struggle. You think it would be at least maybe a gram or something. But when you're talking about a bee, that's not much more than a few grams.
Would they remove the pollen off of their legs? If they remove it all in a big chunk or like pieces? Or?
Typically a big chunk, and then they'll store those as bee breads in the hive. And since they're being held in place with basically just a single leg, or a single hair, they can just sort of slide it off. And in she goes, and you can see there's some guard bees in there. Or once she eventually stops. There we go. There's the guard bee.
So that goes into the honeycomb stuff.
Yeah. Most beehives only have one entrance. So, ooh, Brad makes half-sour pickles. I do love me some cooking shows, but
So do they store the honey, that bee bread is right next to where they put their honey, or do you know if they kind of separate it, like into a whole different cell?
we will talk about that. Or actually, I wanted videos. There's actually a pretty... I had a heck of a time finding good videos of bees cleaning themselves. But this one was some research at Georgia Tech, where basically they took some bees and they coated them with artificial pollen just to watch them clean themselves.
What's that thing on its back?
That's a piece of glue. They glued it to a wire. But here you can see it. There's the foreleg. It's going to just scrape right down its eyeball. And you'll see. There we go. So there's some of the eye. Probably would be a little bit. But yeah, people don't have anything better to do at Georgia Tech. Georgia. All right. So let's jump. So those are the legs. As far as the abdomen is concerned, honestly, there's nothing interesting. I mean, there's the stinger, but we'll talk about that.
Wait, is it true if a bee stings someone, the bee dies later on?
Usually,
Like how soon?
I'll get to that. We'll talk about the stinger in a minute. So, generally, right, as far as the abdomen is concerned, the only thing that's really notable externally is that they do have that constriction where the thorax and the abdomen meet. Technically, it's not a constriction between the abdomen and the thorax. It's between the first segment of the abdomen and the second segment of the abdomen. So, fun fact. Either way. The bees can move the abdomen up and down and side to side, so they have a fair bit of movement there. And that's important when we talk about the waggle dance and how bees communicate distance to flowers and how to find resources. But otherwise, not particularly interesting. So we'll just skip right to the internal anatomy. So more or less, when we look at the inside of a bee, again, it looks more or less like any other insect, except for a few minor modifications to the digestive tract, the reproductive tract, and the endocrine system. So we'll touch on those, and we'll ignore things like respiratory, circulatory, odds and ends like that. So bee digestion. As far as digestion is concerned, it's a pretty typical system. You have a mouth that goes into a foregut. The foregut has the esophagus, the pharynx, the crop, controlled by a proventriculus, right? That little circular valve, the sphincter that controls flow from the foregut to the midgut. You got your midgut, your hindgut. It all does the same stuff. The major difference is that in honeybees, the crop is modified to be almost exclusively used for storage, and they call it the honey stomach. Basically, when a bee goes out and is collecting nectar, or if a bee swarms and it needs lots of energy, they use their crop to store the nectar or the honey for those behaviors. So basically, They swallow the food, it goes all the way through their thorax, and then it hangs out in the crop until they're ready to regurgitate it or to digest it. This is not a true stomach, even though they call it a honey stomach. It does not produce any digestive enzymes, so anything that is in there is basically just in stasis, maybe a little bit of digestion from the enzymes in the saliva, but that's really it. So very, very minor modification. As far as the reproductive system is concerned, a pretty large modification is that if you are a female honeybee, you have an ovipositor, but if you are a worker, that ovipositor is modified into a stinger. The stinger is basically a three-shafted ovipositor that no longer can lay eggs, and it's modified to have this barbed tip, right? So we have these nice little spines. So it's designed that it can be stuck in, but it can't be pulled out. Once it's in the skin of whoever is being attacked, it's going to stay there. Attached to the stinger, they have a specialized gland, which is only well developed in workers, called the venom gland. And the venom gland, unsurprisingly, produces venom to make the sting unpleasant. It also produces alarm pheromones, so that if the venom gland starts pumping out venom, or producing venom, it's also going to release a lot of alarm pheromones, and that's going to alert the rest of the hive, hey, I just stung something, y'all should come here and help me out, and go stinging as well. So basically, this is unique to honeybees. Other insects don't do this, but when a honeybee stings its target, because of these barbs, the stinger stays behind, and the bee will eviscerate itself during the stinging process. So when a bee pulls away, it's going to pull out the muscles that are associated with the stinger, also the venom gland, and a structure called a venom sac, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a little sac full of bee venom. And basically, when the stinger is embedded in your skin, there's a little bunch of muscles around the venom sac that are just constricting over and over again, pumping more and more venom into the sting site. So it's basically a way of a bee to continue stinging the target even after it's gone. This process does remove some vital business from the bee, and so it will kill them.
Some cultures have some therapy benefits. I've seen doctors almost do vaccines of honeybees. What's the reason behind that?
Bee venom is known to have some medicinal properties. So I believe bee venom is an anti-inflammatory. And so some people with arthritis, they'll do bee sting treatments where if you have achy joints, they'll do a bunch of bee stings around that joint, and that's supposed to give you some relief.
It's funny because you said it's anti-inflammatory. When I got stung, the first thing that happened was I got inflamed.
Oh, exactly, right? And so typically the first thing you do when you do get stung is you have a histamine reaction. And yeah, you'll swell up. But I guess that long term, at least some people say long term, it'll reduce inflammation in the area. So I've heard that. Some people say that bee venom is good for, cancer and stuff like that. I mean, bad for cancer cells, good for people with cancer sort of situation.
How do they, you talked about that they can become laying workers, so they can lay eggs, even though they're workers. Do they have to remodify the stinger?
I think that they can still lay with the stinger, but they can't fertilize the eggs, and the eggs are underdeveloped. So I guess they have enough of an ability to actually pass it. So I know I said that they no longer deposit eggs. They can, but not very well. And they won't as long as there's mandibular pheromone from the queen going around the hive. So that's something I don't quite understand, and when I was making this, I thought I need to look into that later.
When did the stinger originate? What predator was it meant for? To fend off or defend itself?
I'm guessing. So something with the stinger also is that the stinger doesn't really stick inside of other insects. If you go and sting other insects, it'll pass in and out of an exoskeleton puncture pretty easily. The stinger seems to only stick in insects that have, or in organisms with elastic skin, where you can sting it and the skin will sort of pinch shut on it. So it seems to be built for mammals. Yeah, humans, mammals, things like that. So like stinging bees, possums, skunks, or not bees, bears. Yeah, bears, possums, skunks, humans, things like that. It seems like they're more built for that.
It's like a barbed hook.
Yeah.
Barbed fish.
Yeah, exactly. And so there are cases where bees will sting, and then they'll manage to pull their stinger out. It seems that bees have the ability when they sting, they can walk in little circles and sort of slowly work the stinger out. And some beekeepers will just sort of, if they get stung by a bee, they'll just let them work it out so that they don't kill it. But most of the time, if a bee stings you, what do? You smash it, and you push that barb in really well. And so anyway, if you have the stinger in you and it's sitting there and it's pumping the venom, right? Oftentimes your gut reaction is, I'm going to pull it right out. Something to keep in mind is if you pinch it and pull it out, you're going to be pinching that venom sac. You're going to squeeze all the venom into you in one go. It's recommended that what you should do is scrape it off. So get like a credit card or something and just get a credit card and email me your number, CVV, and your expiration date. And then, yeah.
So only the workers die, not the males.
Yeah, so the drones don't have a functional stinger because they're males, they don't have an ovipositor, so they don't have the hardware. And queens, their ovipositor is an actual ovipositor. So it's not barbed, it's not built for stinging. So you'll get a very different structure.
Is there an animal is there an animal that's like most susceptible to these things, or is it just pretty much humans? Because I know obviously not the honey badger or anything else like that. But I mean,
Skunks, bears, possums, all those guys, they don't like stings. Yeah, so I actually just learned this. Apparently, so skunks are a big problem for beekeepers around here because they'll take their bees and put them up in the foothills during certain times of the year to take advantage of the flowers that grow in the meltwaters. And there's a lot of skunks up there. And so there's all sorts of different ways that people manage them, but apparently the easiest way to avoid skunk problems is to put the hives on a stand about 8 to 12 inches off the ground. And skunks won't mess with that because to reach inside, what they do is they just sort of reach their hands in and like scoop comb down. But if they have to stand up on their hind legs to reach in, that exposes their belly, which is soft and doesn't have nearly as much fur covering it, and they'll get stings on their belly, and that'll discourage them right away. So it does work against any number of animals. It seems to work for other insects to a certain extent. They do a lot of stings. But yeah, we as humans are particularly ill-suited to dealing with honeybees, or bee swarming in general. Humans have managed to display some level of mastery over most animals, but it seems that a swarm of bees can reduce, most anyone to a swatting, sort of swatting and screaming and running and all of that. We're not particularly good with dealing with several thousand things trying to hurt us all at once. Okay, just to touch on the glandular system. We already talked about a bunch of the glands, the head, hypopharyngeal, mandibular, and thoracic labial glands. There are a few other ones that are important to bees. These are split between endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Endocrine glands are those that secrete hormones. So they pump hormones into the body to regulate growth. If we're talking about endocrine glands, bees have all the typical endocrine glands that we expect in most insects. They have the ability to produce brain hormone. They have the ability to produce juvenile hormone, all those things that insects use to go through their development stages. But bees also have a couple of very interesting exocrine glands. These are glands that secrete pheromones to the outside world. And they have a couple of those that regulate bee behavior pretty well. So the first one is the nasonov, or the scent gland. So this is an exocrine gland that's located on the very far tip of the abdomen on the dorsal side. And it's sort of right here. Here you see we have two sclerites. We have the very most anal of them, and the 6th and the 7th tergites. And right here in this little gap, there's a small hole that the nasonoph gland releases its pheromone into. Basically, it releases a bunch of terpenoids that are attracted to bees. So it puts out this pheromone, and it's a signal to bees, hey, this is where you want to be. There's good stuff here. And so they'll release this at the entrance of a hive to help lost bees find their way back to the hive. When they find a water source, they'll release this pheromone to attract them to that water. Basically, it's just a way of getting lots of bees from the hive to all come to the same place. So what they'll typically do is they'll sort of stick their abdomen way up in the air. They'll stretch it so that the nasonoph gland is exposed, and then they'll fan their wings to blow the pheromone out into the wider world.
Do they know? Because this gland, it says, do the bees know when they're coming to this?
It's kind of like
Are they go into water? Are they go into a flower? Are they go into their hive? Or do they just
I don't believe
sense it and go?
I think they just sense it and go. So I don't think they have the ability to tell if it's a water signal or a hive signal. One area where they might know what it is so when you have a bee swarm, right? You have a whole bunch of bees surrounding a queen sitting on like a stick or something. The workers will send out scouts to go and find a new nesting location. And when the scouts find a new nesting location, some of them will fly back and tell the other bees, and some of them will stay at the location and they'll fan out with the nasonoph gland to see via signal like this is the spot. And so in that case, they may very well know that, okay, we're heading towards the new hive site. But beyond that, I'm not sure. There are two sets of glands associated with the stinger, Dufour's and the, I should have practiced this, Koschevnikov. That's not so bad. There was a very big collective of Polish and Eastern European bee scientists, and so hence names like Nasonov and Koschevnikov. But either way, these are associated with the stinger in the worker bees, and they are most well known for producing alarm pheromones. So basically, ways to tell other bees that something bad is happening. So generally, the way this turns out in a behavioral sense is, let's say an invader comes into the hive. You have a wasp, or you have a skunk or something like that showing up trying to get in the hive. What the workers will do is they'll sort of walk with their abdomen stuck out in front of them, and they'll extend their stinger, and they'll excrete a single drop of venom on the tip of that stinger. And in that venom, there's a whole ton of alarm pheromone. And basically, they're just permeating the hive with the smell of alarm pheromone. That's just telling all the other bees to get down to the entrance and to start putting on a defense of the hive.
Is that the same pheromone as when it leaves an ovipositor somewhere that it lets out as an alarm pheromone? Because you said that when you get stung, it
Yeah.
releases, or is it the same one?
Same one. Yeah, they generally, so I said earlier that the venom gland makes it. That was a little wrong. The venom gland makes the venom. Dufour's and the Koschevnikov glands actually make the alarm pheromone. But it all goes in the venom sac and it's sort of combined. So when you sting, it's the same sort of alarm pheromone. Just when you yank your guts out and those glands are exposed and they sort of permeate the air with the alarm pheromone. Now the last set of glands is the Arnhart, or the aerolium glands. And these are the glands that are found in the aerolium, which, as you remember, is a little pad on between the tarsal claws and the tip of the foot. And this produces an attractant pheromone, sort of like the nasonoph gland does. Except this one is secreted by the tarsal segment. So if the bees have something that they want to attract other bees to, they'll sometimes wipe their feet on it and deposit little bits of this pheromone to attract them. So it's used mostly as a marking thing. So marking a hive, marking a walkway within the hive, marking flowers, odds and ends like that. So here, we can just sort of see that the gland itself is up here inside the last tarsal segment, and it stretches down into the aerolium where it's secreted. All right. So beyond that, sort of the last thing I wanted to touch on, So if we look at queens and drones, I've been giving a general overview of bee anatomy from the worker's perspective, the things that set workers apart. If we look at queens and drones, it's pretty much the same as the workers with a few modifications. In general, what we find with queens and drones is that they just don't have all the specialized equipment for collecting food. So they don't have all those specialized hairs on their legs for collecting pollen. They don't have the combs, the rakes, the presses, and all of that. They tend not to have stingers. Queens don't have stingers. Drones don't have ovipositors at all, so they are different from workers in that way. And as far as body shape is concerned, we find that in general they're large, right? This is to house their reproductive equipment. If you're a queen, you need a long abdomen to house all the eggs you produce, so they're going to have a much longer body. Drones, with the testicles, they tend to be very large, so they need a large sort of barrel-shaped body to house those. We also find that they have very poorly developed glands and mouthparts because they don't participate in hive building. So they don't tend to have any wax glands, they don't have any of those Nasonov scent glands, and their mouthparts tend to be built just basically for eating. They're not made for shaping comb or helping out in any way. And then beyond that, though, the queen does tend to have much more well-developed glandular systems in her head. She has those mandibular glands, of course, that I've talked about a few times. So those are highly developed in the queen and poorly developed in the workers. Oh yeah, I included this picture just because I saw it in the textbook and thought, wow, there's really not much to a bee larva. If you look at the bee larva, this is the head, right? And this is the gut. And that's basically all they are. They're basically a gut.
They don't have brains or anything?
I mean, they do, but they're like itty bitty tiny. Like they have all the parts, right? They have brains, they have circulatory system and all that, but it's really small. It doesn't do very much. Like the vast majority of all of their energy is put into this gut, and they've got a tiny little silk gland right here that's attached to the mouth parts for secreting silk. But yeah. So we're not going to talk about bee larva anatomy. All right. So let's talk about bee nests. This is where we'll wrap up. I probably don't even have 15 minutes to cover, so probably get out a little early today. So let's talk about bee nests. Bees originally evolved as woodland creatures. They, as best we can tell, almost all of the wild bee species live in wooded areas, primarily. They tend to all show a preference for hives that are built into hollow or dead trees. They really like enclosed, tight, dark spaces. And so it seems that when a bee is looking for a hive, it's all about location, location, location. If they can find a cavity that meets sort of the basic requirements for, basic bee survival, they'll build a hive there. So as far as location is concerned, there's a couple key features that we find consistently in feral hives. The first of which is they really like them to be sheltered and darkened. So bees, ideally, want their hive to be completely enclosed with just one entrance. They prefer it if that entrance is high off the ground, around about 10 feet or so high enough that most things can't get into it. And they prefer in darkened, enclosed places that have evidence of bees living there previously. So bees like it when they walk into an enclosure and they find evidence of bee combs. Maybe they can smell bees or they find propolis on the walls. All those things tell bees that there have been successful colonies there in the past, and that's a good sign that they can be successful there in the future. Beyond that, bees like it if they have very small and very defensible entrances. And bees only want one entrance to their hive. If they find an enclosure that has multiple entrances, typically they'll use propolis to close one of them shut, and they will maintain a single entrance. Typically the entrances are less than 10 square inches, so think of that as like 2 inches by 5 inches. That's about as big as they go. They like them to be high, so if you have a vertical hive, they would prefer it if the entrance is high up near the top of the hive. and they seem to show preference for the direction that the entrance faces. Bees show preference for hives with entrances that face south or east. For whatever reason, they don't seem to like north-facing entrances. I'm not sure if that has to do with sun angles. That would be the closest I can guess. The book did not elaborate on why certain entrances are
Well,
preferred
it would
over
make
others.
sense because we mentioned earlier that they are not very attracted to light at the early stages.
Mm-hmm.
Correct?
That's true. Yeah, so the bees, have certain stages where they are attracted to light and certain ones where they're not. So I guess if you're facing south in the northern hemisphere, you're going to get a little bit better sunlight. Yeah. So that might be important. Also, bees use the sun to navigate. So it might be better if they fly out of the hive and they have pretty immediate ability to view the sun for navigation purposes.
So is this preferred direction what beekeepers use when making their own hives? They face it to the south?
I have not heard that from beekeepers before, but it seems to me that I imagine some of the big commercial guys think about that. Volume is important. They want to have a relatively large hive. There was a guy who went out, there's a guy at Cornell, who basically went out and he just measured a whole ton of wild hives in the woods around Cornell's campus. And he came up with, on average, they were around 8 inches in diameter and 60 inches tall, which gives you a volume of about 40 liters or so. And experimentation has shown that bees generally will live in anything from 20 to like 100 liters, but they really prefer the 40 to 60 liter range. That seems to be the volume they prefer. And if you look at a standard brood box of a Langstroth hive, it is almost exactly 40 liters. So it's sort of right there in that range that they like. We tend to find that they like spaces that they can fill with nice parallel combs that incorporate bee space, right? That perfect sort of space between the combs so the bees can navigate. And we also tend to find that they're very good at separating the brood and the food within the comb. Specifically, they're good at separating brood and pollen from honey. So they have a very segmented comb. So bees originally lived in woods, but humans can take bees anywhere. They basically, as long as you provide bees with a proper bee box that resembles a natural cavity, they will live in it happily and go out and forage. Of course, that issue is that they will live anywhere that resembles a cavity they like, so anything with a nice small hole in it and an empty chamber inside. So it's pretty typical to see people with bees inside their houses. Here, of course, is someone they've removed the bricks from the outside to excavate the bees. But, I mean, we get calls here at the university pretty regularly from people who have bees in their garage, bees in their walls. There's a church up on Ballard that apparently has had bees for like 30 years up in their steeple, and no one will get rid of them for them. But you'll have bees even in like, old junker cars that people have parked for too long and things like that. Bees will settle in most any space.
So are honeybees particularly naturalistic to never stop producing and honey? So like if they run out of space, like they just leave the honey and find somewhere else, they start swarming. Or...
So if they run out of space, so like let's say you're building in the side of the truck, right, and you run out of space, the natural tendency is not to abandon the honey, but it's to swarm. So they will swarm, divide the hive in half. Half the hive will stay in the truck, the other half will go out and find a new location. And they'll basically just maintain this hive indefinitely. So they'll sort of hit a point where they can't expand any further, and they'll just say, well, this colony's never going to be much bigger than this.
So eventually the honey will just turn old.
Well, they'll eat it.
They'll eat it?
Yeah. So, I mean, the honey is their overwintering resource, so they'll consume the honey, and by the end of the winter, the honey will be pretty well depleted, and then the next spring they'll fill all those combs back up again with new honey.
That's also interesting to know like how much to even harvest the hive, because they're going to use some pollen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly, and that's sort of a really interesting point in bee research is like how do bees know when it is the proper amount of honey, the proper amount of pollen? How do they determine when they produced enough brood versus when they haven't? And it seems that honeybees are kind of queuing on any number of environmental variables that shape very small behavioral changes amongst the workers and the queen. But I am not well versed enough to give a good answer as to how they do it specifically.
Yeah, because we can kill a hive or a colony by taking everything right home.
Yes. Yeah, very easily. Yeah, it could stress them out very badly. So I think if you took everything, the hive might even just pack up and leave and go and swarm and create a new colony. But if we do that, say, in the middle of the fall when there's no more flowers, that colony's going to be out of luck. But when we eventually set up the hives here in Fresno, we're going to be in good position because city bees actually produce honey more or less year-round because there's almost always something blooming in the city for bees, just because people are maintaining flowers in their yards. So we're irrigating, we have flowers that bloom in the winter, summer, the fall, spring. So bees are finding nectar resources all the time. So here in Fresno, I anticipate that we'll be having pretty good pollen production or honey production all the time. But if you're like a commercial beekeeper, when the almonds drop their flowers, there's nothing out there for them to eat. So you gotta transport them around to get stuff.
How do you find out how much like forage your bees will need? Is it like a set number per hive or like set something?
Generally what you would do is you would open up the hives and you would look at how many pollen cells there are versus honey cells versus brood cells, and you could get an idea if they're low on any given resource. And then what you might need to do is amend their food with sugar syrup or pollen cakes, and you can sort of help them out with those things. Some beekeepers very firmly believe in once the nectar flow is over, you've got to provide them with pollen, like all summer and the like, in order to maintain them. But a lot of keepers don't like that because pollen cakes are kind of expensive. You can buy pollen from like China. You can get like big bags of pollen, but a lot of beekeepers are suspicious because they're like, we don't even know what that is pollen from. You know, it's just a bag of pollen. You know, it's not like it's got nutritional facts like, ooh, sunflower pollen. You know, it's like who knows what this pollen is? Who knows what they were spraying on the crop that produced this pollen or whatever? And so people are suspicious of that. So if you want to buy like high quality protein cakes that have like pollen or pollen substitutes in it, it gets kind of pricey.
How much do you think
How much?
is one of those cakes?
I couldn't say off the top of my head. But it's a couple. Individually, they're not that pricey. It might be, you know, a couple bucks for a cake, maybe one or two. But if you're putting them in 5,000 hives, and the bees are eating one of them every week or two, you know, you can spend a lot of money feeding all of your hives.
For 10 pounds, it's about $24.
Okay, yeah, so that's not too bad. But again, if you're throwing a pound a hive in, and you got thousands of hives, the costs catch up with you. So a lot of these guys make their own feed. If you're like a big guy and you have the experience. But a lot of the smaller beekeepers will just go to like Dave Ant and buy like a case of food. I'd eventually like to start making bee food, but I need to get bees first. So, priorities. Okay, so let's say you have a swarm. They're hanging out. They've got scouts going around. They find a space. They find, say, a hollow tree. Oh, actually, one last point. So let's say you've got a situation like this. So sometimes people will call you up and they'll say, I've got a bee swarm, I need it removed. If it's a bee swarm in like a tree outside their house, it's pretty easy. You get like a 5-gallon bucket on a stick, and you like smack, you know, the swarm, they drop in, you put a little lid on the bucket, you can take the swarm back and dump it into a box. But some people say they have a swarm, but what they really have is they have an established hive inside their house, in the walls. So if you've got a hive inside the walls, chances are you're not getting it out alive. Those bees are already established. They're inside the walls. If you want to get them out, you're going to have to do this. You're going to have to literally tear the wall open, remove the entire hive. What most people do is they just gas them. So you pop a little bit, you pop a tube, you know, into the entrance, and you dump in some phosphine or something like that, and you gas the hive out and kill them that way. So, yeah.
anything bad happen.
I read that you could create artificial swarms by removing the queen, and they'll follow the queen.
Yes.
So would that be an option?
But you'd have to remove the entire wall to get to the queen, because she's going to hang out on the brood cells, and that's sort of right in the middle of the hive. So I guess you could enlarge the hole wide enough that you could like stick your arm in, feel around for the queen. This one's little. This one's stinging me. But yeah, probably not a realistic approach for this problem. Okay, so let's say you're a swarm. You're hanging out on a tree limb. You're waiting for the scouts to come back. They find a spot. You go there. The first thing you do is they prepare the space. So generally what bees will do is they'll crawl around on the inside of the hive, and they will smooth it out. They'll find all the cracks that lead to the outside world, and they'll fill them with propolis. They'll take any of the walls of it, and they'll put propolis on it. Basically, they cover everything with propolis. Propolis is antibacterial, so it'll kill any sort of bacteria living in the wood. It'll suppress fungal growth. It basically just makes the hive nice and safe. Beyond that, they will also reduce the entrance to the preferred size. So if they're calling in the entrance, they think it's a little too large, they'll pack it with propolis until it's just the exact right entrance size that they want. And if you've got like those Carolean bees, those ones from the Black Sea region, those guys love to propolis everything. So they'll make the entrance like this big, just tiny little entrances. And then they'll begin building the beeswax combs, which is all basically just combs made from wax secreted by the abdomen. So, as far as bee comb is concerned, it is exclusively composed of hexagonal cells with a 3-part pyramid bottom. So basically what I mean by that is, right, if you're looking at a cell, right, it's a nice little hexagon, but if you look at the bottom, basically is shaped like that. It's sort of an indentation, except, you know, these lines actually meet. Well, I was never an art major. But they'll meet at the bottom in a nice little triangle shape. Likewise, you can sort of see that pyramid shape right here in this picture. The combs are built with a central midridge down the middle that's solid beeswax. And then they have 2 sets of cells that branch off in each direction from that central midridge. And in general, what bees will do is they'll start at the top of the hive. They have something they will anchor the comb to, and then they'll slowly build it down and outwards from that central starting point. Sometimes they'll start combs on the sides as well, and they'll build them in towards the middle, and they'll meet that central comb. But they always start at the top and work their way downward. The cells have a slight tilt. They tend to tilt upwards away from the central midridge. This is to stop honey from dripping out the end. So gravity will pull the honey back to the central midridge. And in general, we see 2 different types of cells, and only 2 types of cells. There are the worker cells, which have a 5mm diameter, and we have the drone cells, which have the 6mm diameter. And in general, if we look at hives, the vast majority of the cells are worker cells, with a minority being drone cells. In feral hives, about 15% of all cells are dedicated to drones. But we can't say that for managed hives, because in managed hives, beekeepers will insert and remove drone cells in order to manipulate populations of bees. So there's not a fixed set of drone cells in a managed hive. That being said, drone cells and worker cells are not exclusively reserved for producing drones and workers. These cells will be filled with honey, they'll be filled with pollen, they'll be used for any number of purposes over the course of their existence. So just to look here, right, typical hexagonal shape. Here we have the central midridge. You can see the rows of cells on each side in this cut comb. And the last point, I know you're going to stay a little bit late for this, but this is really quick. So oftentimes it's brought up, why do bees have hexagonal shapes? Why not some other shape? Why don't they make perfect circles? And, you know, it's pretty clear that the big advantage of hexagons is that they don't waste space, right? You can pack a whole bunch of hexagons right up against each other, and they will share all their walls so that you make a real minimum of walls. If I were to pack a bunch of circles together, I'm going to have wasted space, basically anywhere where the circles meet, and that's wasted wax.
What about squares?
Exactly. So that raises this question: why don't bees, make just a whole bunch of square cells, or why don't they make a whole bunch of equilateral triangles that all fit together? And basically, what happened is that this mathematician, well, basically all the beekeepers said that what they suspected was that it used the least wax to get the most volume to produce hexagons. That if you went with triangles or squares, you had to invest more wax to store the same amount of honey. And so about maybe 10 years ago, a mathematician published this huge mathematical paper where he proved mathematically that hexagons are the most efficient shape for wax usage in bees. So that is the case, that bees sort of accidentally through evolution came across the fact that hexagons are incredibly efficient. And this is important because, like I mentioned in that note I posted on Blackboard, it takes a heck of a lot of honey to make wax. In general, to make 1 unit of wax, bees are going to have to consume and transform 8 units of honey. So to get 1 pound of beeswax, you need to consume 8 pounds of honey. So if you're a beekeeper, right, you don't want bees making wax all the time. And bees don't want to be making wax all the time. They want to use their wax as efficiently as possible. So that's why they do those hexagons. That's also why beekeepers tend to recycle their combs all the time. They spin them, spin the honey out, and they put the old combs back in, because that way the bees don't have to go through all the effort of remaking all that wax.
What happens, like, just a little part of the wax comb gets damaged? Like, what do the bees do in reaction to that?
So if you have damaged combs, bees will repair it. So they'll basically collect all that wax, reform it, and reshape the cells. That's really about it. I mean, they'll fix it. You do have certain parts of the hive where the wax, you all can go, by the way. You do have some parts of the hive where, especially in wild hives, right, where, you know, maybe the wall is rounded, and so the comb doesn't sit exactly flush. So you'll get parts of the hive where the comb has to like wrap the wall, and then you'll get funny shaped cells in that area. And bees oftentimes will not use cells that are oddly shaped, or they'll just fill them in with propolis or something.